Well, that's like just your opinion, man.
So hello and welcome to the Audio Opinion Show, where audio people gather to give their opinions about things because somebody thought that would be a great idea for a show. And we gather about once a week and we sit around and just carp and moan about stuff because that's just the thing that we do. I am joined by some of my closest friends and colleagues who I've worked with, and then some folks that I've never seen in person before. And so we got folks that do comsy things and live show things and broadcast things and sports things and all kinds of different audio things. So broad range of experience and knowledge. Unfortunately, I am not joined by my co-host, Andy Broughton, which is bad because I'm almost sure to screw up something along the way because he keeps me, and we don't have any Canadians. No Canadians. Oh man, it's not going to be a very good show. I'm sorry, but there are no Canadians on the show tonight, and that's a sad thing.
We could try to talk like Canadians.
Yeah. I will get in trouble if I like do an impression or it's like, you're mugging me, aren't you, buddy? No, I'm not. No, I'm not, Guy. I'm not mugging you, buddy. I'm stopping. All right, let's crank up the poll so we can figure out what we're actually going to talk about that is a thing of importance. So based on a couple of chat comments, I believe last week or the week before, I am going to ask the most important question, which is, have you seen The Princess Bride? Have you seen The Princess Bride? Possible answers are yes, no, Wallace Shawn. So, have you seen The Princess Bride? Possible answers yes, no, Wallace Shawn. And if you're paying close attention, you'll note you can actually choose more than one thing. So if you want to choose yes and Wallace Shawn, which would probably be what I would do, you are allowed to do that. So it does appear that people do know how to work the polls, and we are going to find out who has seen The Princess Bride. Ending the poll, sharing the results, and the results make me a little sad. I mean, Wallace Shawn wins because Wallace Shawn always wins, and that's good. Like, that's a good thing.
More than half knows.
More than half knows. Don't raise your hand if you voted no, because I don't want to be disappointed in my fellow panelists.
If AV can just put it in one of the other boxes, we can watch it during the show.
Which I think we talked about that last week, and I don't hate that idea.
Exactly.
I'm drawing a blank.
How many people voted yes and no?
Wait, and I don't even know. Like there's no way for me to know. I will say I'm drawing a blank on his name. The guy who joins us a lot, Dave Sturzenberger. I messed up his name. Dave Stirs something or other.
Right.
I actually posted on Facebook or shared it with me or whatever. He was on a plane somewhere and actually was watching The Princess Bride on the airline seat back and was like, see, now I can. I'm like, yes, one person at a time, changing the world one person at a time. All right, so we've all figured out how to operate a poll because that's kind of the point of that. So let's find out what our topic for the day is. Some of these were what we had last week, so there were choices, some are not. So what's our topic for the day? Number one, what do you think isn't talked about enough in audio? Number two, conversely, what do you think is talked about too much in audio? I have opinions about that. Number three, how much sampling rate and bit depth is, quote, enough, unquote? And fourth, a very pedestrian audio question. What's the next piece of gear you want to buy? So possible options. What do you think isn't talked about enough in audio? What do you think is talked about too much in audio? How much sampling rate and bit depth is, quote, enough, unquote? And finally, what's the next piece of gear you want to buy? As always, as the host, I don't get a vote. My panelists choose the topic. It's not my fault. I see we have 8 votes. I see we have 8-ish people. So 9 votes now. The votes are in. So I'm going to end the poll and we will share the results. And it would appear that what we are going to talk about tonight I'm sorry if whoever it was that just said they missed a vote. Sorry. I'm going to have to get the Jeopardy music so everybody knows when the voting is done. Anyway, our topic for the night is, what do you think isn't talked about enough in audio? I kind of wanted the one of, what do you think is talked about too much, but I don't get a vote. So what do you think isn't talked about enough in audio? As someone who likes to talk about audio, Andy Lipnick, what do you think isn't talked about enough in audio? And go.
Well, I didn't vote for that one, and I'm not ready to answer that question.
So in your opinion, you aren't ready. That's your opinion.
That's my opinion. I'm going to pass. You can come back to me later when I have formed some sort of opinion about this question.
Well, as I do know that Matt Kerr spends a significant amount of his time talking about audio things online and other places. What do you think we don't talk about enough as someone with a few decades in the business?
I was all prepared for things that
we talk about
too much. And I'm the one who voted for that.
Okay, somebody help me out here. Go ahead, my friend Pete.
Comms, obviously, nobody ever talks about comms.
You talk about it constantly, but anyway.
No, I do. Nobody else does. They want somebody else to take care of it.
Well,
or A1s and A2s hate it when they have to do their own comms.
There's even a little bit of a subset of that. Like, there's some specifics within comms that are even like, you want to learn how to use Arvon. There is no manual. It's either figured out by trial and error or hope you have a Pete on your show that already knows how to use it.
It's very simple. You just keep clicking and filling in things until it works. That's what I do.
It's exactly it.
Which is akin to the old, how do you mix twiddle and ops till it sounds good?
Years and years ago, I was on a show and we had just gone up and the show had started. The stage manager was calling the cues and the video projector stopped working upstage center. And it was weird. We were projecting from the middle of the stage to upstage. So to fix it, you had to go out on the stage. So I ran out on the stage with a friend of mine, Bruce Kramer, and we were trying to fix it. The video projector, an audio and comm guy, and we got it working. And when we went off stage, he said, "How did you know how to do that?" I said, "I don't know. I just kept pressing buttons till it worked."
Which sometimes is the best that you can do. You just press buttons until it works. Well, exactly. And I actually go ahead, Jesse.
I'll while we're on comms, I would say something about comms and why there's possibly the reason that there's so few people that choose that as a focus, besides the fact that it's more difficult than pushing faders usually, is it's kind of a barrier to entry thing. Like, I'm interested in comms and RF, and I get to do gigs and RF coordinator sometimes, but especially the comms stuff, it's like anybody can get themselves a console and, they played in a band and you're running sound at the local clubs and stuff. It's hard to really get a chance to dive in on a show as a RF, especially comms guy.
Best place is in if you happen to be on a show and you're prepping in the shop and the show has comms on it, dive in there at the very least.
That's good advice. I'd love to hear more about how any comm specialists, I would love to hear about like their kind of point of entry to that. And as far as you say about jumping in on the shop, that's a lot easier if you're a full-time employee of the company. Because if you're called in as a freelancer to prep a show, and you're called in as an A1 or a system tech, to deal with amps and PA distribution and stuff, you're not going to be able to just kind of linger in the comms department and, start poking around. So, I mean, I don't want to get sidetracked, but I would be very interested in hearing any stories from the comm people out there about kind of like their entry point and, career path going down that road.
Well, You start out with this.
and Erskine last week went on a whole that, not that I wouldn't gladly hear his journey again, because it is really interesting. But no, actually, this is a really good thing that doesn't get talked about enough. Even though, Pete, I was giving you a hard time because I you're right. Like, the number of times I show up on gigs, as the A2, and the A1 has absolutely no idea how the comm system works, like none whatsoever. And these are corporate gigs where comms are like critically important to the show. Like, for lots of music things, comms is just like, a headset and a flash beacon, and it's one channel, and that's
right. A couple of shout mics.
Right, a couple shout mics. But, as soon as you get into corporate or theater or broadcast or blah, any of those things, like, comms is king. Like no comms, no show. But it's remarkable how many people don't even know the basics. And I think this is still true. When I was first really getting into it, it was very hard to find resources to actually learn about it. Now I know, and Pete, Pete, I think you even have some links on your website, don't you?
Yeah.
So actually, Pete, put your website, bestaudio.com. Put that
bestaudio.com
in the chat.
Pete,
as well.
I learned almost everything I know about comms from your website.
Yeah, well, it's good, because that's most of my memory is kept on that website.
A good website.
And if you go to bestaudio.com, not to be a salesman and a spokesperson for Pete Erskine's site, he will require you to register, and he does sell those names on the black market for the most money he can. So just be warned. But yeah, when
you also send me a check for $20 for some RF scans too, so we can call it even.
That was a failed attempt to get more people to give me RF scans. I was doing $10 a scan, and hardly anybody ever did it, except I had one tour person who did 2,700 scans, and I paid them the $10 a scan.
I feel like you may be scamming us about the scans. But when I first started working with the Intercom Eclipse system, it was the first time I'd worked with a Matrixcom system, and it's like I could read the manual, and the manual would say, well, this is how this does, and this is how this, and this is how, but it didn't tell you why you would, or like what best practices were, or.
Well, that's the thing, is best practices, because you can learn how to use the equipment, and you can practice programming it. I mean, at least Riedel and RTS, you can get the software and play around with the software, figure out how to program things. You can get a lot of the basics of the programming part in the manuals, and I assume there is some way to do that with Clearcom as well. But I'm frankly pretty unfamiliar with the Eclipse frames. But the idea of who needs to talk to who is really what comms is about. And that part is, you're not going to get out of a book. And that's the part that's going to be hard to.
It's one of the early practical show tech shows, I talked about planning your comm system and who you talk to and how you get that information and how you lay it all out. And that's another good website, practicalshowtech.com. There are 80 some odd 3-hour shows on audio, comm, and other ancillary subjects, even lighting. And so that's a good place to learn. Although I will admit, I can't figure out a piece of equipment from a manual. You can't give me a manual. I can say, well, okay, well, it's supposed to do that, but I need to have it in my hand and run audio through it before I can really figure out how it works.
For me, it needs to be applied. It's like trying to learn a console by sitting in front of it at the shop, until you're under at least some amount of pressure with some sort of specific agenda that you're trying to accomplish. At least for me, it's really hard to find what you even need to learn about that piece of gear, because if you're not trying to accomplish anything specific, you just end up poking around and going down rabbit holes that aren't necessarily
one of the
are going to get you through a show.
One of the things we did on Practical Show Tech was we said we'll never do a regular manufacturer's demo thing. It all has to be about practical use of that device. And I just put 2 links up there. One is a saga of RTS systems. It tells the entire story of how the people at RTS originally invented their own first intercom and how all the trials and tribulations they went through. It reminds me a lot of The Martian and all the trials and tribulations he went through trying to live on Mars. Well, this was the same thing they did with intercom. And a second book, which is Handbook of Intercom Systems by RTS, which covers everything from 2 tin cans all the way up to matrix intercoms, almost without mentioning RTS at all. It's all about theory.
Yeah, that second one in particular, it was a real kind of lifesaver for me. Well, and I read through and studied that after I had done a good bit of comms, and it filled in a bunch of little gaps. That's, we learn a lot of this stuff, no pun intended, practically on the show, Practical Show Tech. But then we end up with these weird little gaps like that in our knowledge base that we just don't quite fully. It was not until very recently that I really grasped what a Beltpack in a 2-wire system actually is doing. I knew how to plug everybody's in. I knew how to adapt it to 4-wire. I knew how to get RTS to clear comm, and I knew whose all systems was clear. I knew all the but actually it's a little mini hybrid. It's basically
magic.
It's a little 4-wire to 2-wire interface. It's just I know what a hybrid. I know that's what it is. That's really what it is. And it was oh, and the whole side tone thing is basically nulling. That's all that is. It's oh, I need more side tone. I just kind of screw up the null, and now I have some side tone. And it was just, I've been doing this for decades, knowing how to make the stuff work in a show, and it was just this light bulb moment of, oh, right. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, and
before ClearCom, before Intercom, there was telephone, and in the telephone there's this little block of some potted stuff with a bunch of terminals on it, and the phone line came in, and everything, and built into there was a little hybrid, which made it so when you're talking into the phone, you don't hear your voice really loud in your ear. It wasn't tunable and adjustable. But I played with those a lot when I was in high school, just doing that kind of stuff and see how that works.
Yeah,
so it's funny to remember shows where the phone company did the comms.
Because at the end of the day, 2-wire comms and phones, analog phone lines are basically the same thing. It's incredibly close. I actually remember one of my earlier. This is a strange gig, but okay. It was I worked at a hospital, in a control room in a hospital, doing live medical shows. And part of what I had to do was take phone lines and turn them into 4-wire things and put them into comm systems and put them into a console. And that's when I first used the AC10T. Am I getting that right?
Something like that.
Interface into a phone line.
Yeah, and it's literally designed to take a phone line and be powered by a ClearCom thing, and it's literally bare wire terminal, and that taught me an awful lot about how it's basically kind of the same technology. But now everything is digital, but we're living in a digital comms world. I think the thing that's interesting to me is that after years and years and years of, decades literally of comm systems essentially being, how do we put this all on one wire and make it on, or 2-wire comms, which is basically put a comm channel on a microphone line, or even better yet, put 2 channels of intercom on a microphone line so we can get it around all over the places and make it really easy. And then, we'll adapt it to 4-wire for some weird esoteric thing we need to do, to now in the digital world, comms is basically all 4-wire matrix systems. That's how it works. That's how it does its thing. We've returned back to 4-wire comms, which is basically just an input and an output. It's just it's mixing. It's no different than anything else that we do with a mixing console. It's just lots of them matrix together. That's
Mac did a really terrific show with President Clinton, and he mixed his comms in his console.
Quite by accident. I mean, not by accident, but because I wasn't familiar enough with the console, and it could have been routed port to port through the console system without ever actually hitting the console, but I didn't know that. So I just hit the console with everything, and then I had a whole layer of 30-something channels of comms, send and return. And when somebody said I can't hear the director, I could first of all PFL that channel and go, well, you're not listening to the director because I hear him fine. Or I could just change the levels, and it was kind of fun. That's not what I was supposed to be mixing. I was supposed to be mixing, 7 different venues live to broadcast, but doing the comms in a Studer Vista was kind of fun.
The same medical show that I was referring to started out as like a couple of little 8-channel mixers in this control room, and grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. And it very quickly became apparent that, the headsets that are on the doctors' heads need to basically be an intercom sometimes because they want to talk to a director or talk to a whatever, and then instantly turn into program, and program returns, and then instantly turn back. And again, if I had known what I know now, it would have been, we need to bring a frame in and do this. Like, that's what needs to happen. But it grew, it started out literally like the company I was working for had a little Tascam 8-channel like analog mixer. And they were like, oh, we kind of do some comm things through here. And there's the phone lines. It was really, really basic. And it grew and grew and grew. And eventually, still there in this little like nurse's break room at the hospital, I had a PM4000, and I was mixing program on half of it and comms on the other half, because half the time the 2 things had to talk to each other. And then the next year, we moved the entire control room to a convention center, and I had a PM4000 monitor console that did nothing but mix comms, and the program was in a completely different desk, and it was just like what you're talking about, Mac, only completely analog. It was, I'm just mixing 4-wire, and I need to hear so and so, just reach up and like, I'm mixing monitors basically. It's like, okay,
exactly.
Now you can hear them. Okay, now you don't want to hear them. Okay.
Well, so one of the venues here in town has 2
and I've
theaters
lost my
in it.
earpiece, so talk.
No. One of the venues here in town has 2 theaters in it where someone years ago built out these elaborate systems on the fly rail that enabled everyone to have comm and have it duck out the speaker box above them and yada, yada, yada. And they didn't just buy the ClearComm speaker boxes, and everyone is mystified to this day how it works and are very concerned about how they continue to operate it when they start switching everything over to like HelixNet and whatnot. And I keep telling them that they don't need to be afraid of this, because what the engineer who built this out did is basically tore apart a ClearComm Beltpack and wired it to a relay so that when you click the button on the fist mic, it kills this speaker, sends that signal back to the comm system, and when someone talks back, it hits an amplifier that goes to the speaker. And it's like, they just created a very elaborate, exploded version of Clearcom Beltpack, turning all of this audio into 4-wire with a relay to turn the speaker on and off. It's not hard. You can just come 4-wire off of your controller and have a relay system that each one of these fist mics comes and goes.
What is hard is back in the day, Sound Associates used to make a speaker station that was based on a Chaos intercom that was hands-free. You would just talk to it and it would talk to you. No touching it involved. And they were on the fly rail of every theater in Broadway.
I think now we call that Zoom, but
Well, it was a box about this big that had 2 speakers on it.
Yeah.
Now we call it
It's
Alexa.
safe to say that nowadays any large or even like mid to large scale comm system is not going to be analog 2-wire or 4-wire. It's all over IP, right? If you're doing
It's a mix.
you might
It
have
depends
like
on the show you're doing.
It's gradually moving to all IP. Yes.
so it's when you are you're sending in and out of these major season stuff, and you might have local headsets at Tech World or backstage that are over analog 2 or 4-wire RTS, Clearcom or whatever. But if you really want to learn to deploy comm systems on large scale shows, it's really about, it's not about the pinouts, it's about the IP addressing and the
certainly
IP aspect and the software to route these things, right?
Certainly, to future proof yourself, you need to know that.
yeah,
Because that's clearly, the way things are going to go in the future. There are still plenty of analog matrices around in TV trucks.
but it's definitely we're moving inexorably in the
Right.
and it's actually been interesting. I'm a big Clearcom Eclipse matrix guy, which is a little odd. I just happened to stumble into it, but it's been interesting with each iteration of the new card that they put out, or the new thing that they put out. The software that basically runs the matrix has gradually become less and less friendly to any of the old analog. Like, just gradually we're moving, and they try to remain backward compatible to go because there's, like you said, there's lots of legacy systems, lots of installed systems. People have spent a ton of money on this stuff and they want it to still work, but they are definitely pushing everybody towards IP based, all the new user stations are all, AES67 IP based,
You've added all those IP settings and all those ports you have to worry about. And I was just working today on a job which involves AES67 and Bolero, and there's about 3 or 4 different things you have to set in each different direction to make it work right. And it's not as intuitive. It's more like you actually have to learn how to do it and actually do it, to where that's the reason I like Riedel intercom software a lot, because it's very intuitive, the basic software stuff. But it does get very complicated as soon as you add all that silly networking stuff.
Well, and the big, go ahead, whoever's talking.
Does anybody else draw a map when they're setting these systems up, designing them?
A what?
Draw a map. Like, I actually draw it out, how the whole damn thing's gonna run, A to B, B to C, the whole thing. That's the only way I can keep it straight in my head.
I've been using a web program called Lucid Chart that's free to do line drawings for a lot of my smaller shows that I don't necessarily have like Vectorworks drawings to base off of. So when it's just like, hey, how do I need to get this wired together? I've been using Lucid Chart to just quickly zip together a design. And actually, one of the things that's on my to-do list this week is to go in and figure out if I can build out presets, like some symbology that automatically is some of the pieces of gear that I use more regularly. But Like
I just find doing that, you know, once I've drawn it out and I've thought it through, I never forget what's where and how it's all gonna work, how it's all gonna go together. And when somebody comes up with that, oh, by the way, can we add this? It's not a problem because I already know what's where and how to do that. But if I don't draw it out, I sit there and go, let me find out. Which is the wrong answer.
That you guys are talking about. You're talking about situations where you have multiple remote sites talking to each other, right?
Not even that. In a theater or on a show, you know, doing a corporate gig, I still draw it out because I want to know. When I'm that guy, I want to know where all that stuff is and how it's flowing.
Yeah,
So at what point would you say that you need to go from, like, you know, the times that I see this stuff, just to tell you where my head's at, is usually on corporate shows where you have a free speak system and then, you know, some ClearCom drops coming off of that for front of house, you know, Tech World, A2 World, whatever, but it's all one site. At what point do you have to start implementing these systems that I haven't used, like Bolero, Riedel, and stuff? Where do those? At what point do those come into play? These matrix switched.
When there's enough money for them, because they're expensive.
It's not a show requirements thing.
Yeah, when the show demands it, then you have to do it, but it's expensive.
Well, and like OSA, when they bought their AES-67 Bolero / smart panel Riedel rig, the thought process that the engineer who spec'd it had was that they were buying it based on, I think, 64 frames, so that they could break it up and potentially use it for smaller shows and send out a frame with 8 Bolero and 8 panels and use it on more budget conscious shows, and then combine it all for the giant Google conference that needed 4 times what that little show needed or something.
Yeah, like LMG did the same thing.
And go ahead, Mac.
I'm not sure it was a successful plan, at least, but it is a plan.
The OSA plan it simplifies everything because they basically are all AS-67 cards with a few Dante and a couple of analog cards, but your panels and your Bolero all work on the AS-67 cards. So it's on the same network. And you take that a little bit more, you take a ClearCom HelixNet, stick it on the same network, and interface 8 channels into your Riedel, and now everything's on the network. You just plop in a Beltpack wherever you need it, plop in put a Bolero wherever you want. Mac and I are going to do basically that same system in May.
Okay, so here's another question, and we don't have to keep going down this rabbit hole if anybody doesn't want to, but interfacing these multiple systems, where I see shows that have, you know, Riedel comms with Bolero, with FreeSpeed, with HelixNet. Why do you need to have multiple systems all together? Why can't you just make it consistent and have everybody?
First of all, Riedel and Bolero are one thing. So it's not using 2 different things. If you're using Riedel with FreeSpeak, that's different. You've got to interface them a little bit. And often it's because that's what the production house has, or a show can afford, or the designer, let's say me, doesn't want to use the old 2-channel digital Riedel Beltpacks, wants to use HelixNet instead, which is all programmable over the network. And even though it's a little bit more complicated because it's another manufacturer, has to be another interface, it's just the tools that are available.
Well, it reminds me a little bit of, you know, when we first got into digital mixing consoles, the dream was, and then, you know, every concert, there'll just be one digital mixing console out front and one digital mixing console on stage for monitors, and we'll do a digital split into one big stage box, and life will be fantastic. It will be great, and that's all we'll ever do.
And every console will use the same program to program it.
Right. It'll be a piece of cake, and we'll just recall the next band. And then that, of course, confronted the reality of the real world, which is that, front of house guy for band A wants to use Digico, and front of house guy from band B wants to use Yamaha, and band C or monitor guy wants to use an S6L, and front of house guy wants to use a Digico, or, and if it's a big enough act and there's enough money and the engineers, because they are hired by the band, have enough pull, then they get to spec whatever it is that they want. And then you end up with this crazy world where I've got a few pictures. I won't try to dig them up, but fairly recently I did a show, and it was at least eight, like large, might have been 10. They were double stacked 5 wide. So yeah, it was 10 like big amp rack sized racks full of splitters and stage boxes. And it was just because we had every brand of console like manufactured was there. And then there was a guy who did nothing but analog split stuff to make sure that everybody got all the thing. And I just looked at it and thought, I feel like I took a bold step back into the 80s, but it was because, the truck is Studer, and the RF guy is using a Yamaha, and the front of house is a Digico, and the monitors is, on and on and on. And so, comms is often the same way, or it's as simple, with a lot of these larger shows, you have multiple vendors that are involved. And so the truck might be RTS, and they may be deploying Bolero, but then the in-house PA company may be deploying FreeSpeak, and they may have a Helix net system, and those things have to talk to each other, but only in certain ways. And that's where, Pete Erskine earns his keep.
Well, that's really the situation that most often causes two different systems to be used, a truck and inside, because 90% of trucks are all RTS Atom, at least in the United States, and hardly any rental houses rent RTS Atom. So you're stuck using something else on the inside, which means interfacing. It's gotten a little bit easier now that Atom or RTS has Dante cards available, and Riedel and Clearcom all have Dante cards, so you can interface over Dante fairly easy.
Well, and at that point, we keep, and for anybody who's listening to this later and is like, oh, comms, wah, 4-wire, wah.
We don't talk about it enough.
But we don't talk about it enough, which is actually why I'm not trying even remotely to change the topic, because we're now talking about it.
We don't talk about Bruno.
True. But basically, 4-wire intercom, we keep using that term, but all it is just a line level signal going in and a line level signal coming out. It's like 2 mic wires. It's as simple as that. And so if you can get a large quantity of those simple line level inputs and out, it's brand agnostic. So if you can get a bunch of Dante cards on a bunch of different kinds of systems, it's very easy to say, I'm going to take these 32 4-wire ports and I'm going to tie them ins and outs between this frame and that frame. And now I can make these two talk to each other, because basically Adam is talking to Dante, is talking to Dante, is talking to Eclipse, and Dante is the bridge. Before that, it was analog, essentially XLR cables. It was analog, just regular old line level signals was the interface. But when you start having to interface 32 channels or 40 channels or 64 or whatever of 4-wire, it gets really
using
messy.
the decrepit DT12 cables off the truck.
God, if I never see another DT12 cable, it's too soon.
Those always come in top shape.
Yeah.
Well, and the first year that I did comms for Google Next, we had a whole scenario where it was a Riedel panel system with a FreeSpeak and HelixNet that I had to interface. And the audio designer comes over and it's just like, man, that patching is just ugly. And I'm like, yeah, I have to pass a bunch of 2-wire and 4-wire back and forth. Like, I can only clean that up so much when we haven't made like consistent patchable, like integrated systems, when it's literally someone's rented FreeSpeak and someone else's rented HelixNet and your Riedel rack, none of it has multi-pins and none of it has pin patches. Yeah, it's going to be ugly. But yeah, the next year we had Bolero and AES 67 Riedel panels and never looked back.
And it's worth mentioning, you know, the topic, you know, what things don't get talked about enough. And here we are talking about comms for an hour, which is great, because it is something you always need. And it is absolutely bread and butter basic, but the technology continues to march on. The real devil is in, like, it's not difficult-ish. It's not difficult to take a Riedel system, buy, you know, $500,000 worth of Riedel stuff and plug it in and have everything talk to each other. That's relatively straightforward. But as soon as you have to interface it with someone else's system, or you have to interface it to radios, or you have to interface it to telephone lines, or you have to interface it to, you know, and end client just wants to say, the director wants to be able to talk to, you know,
right,
Seth Smith, who's sitting in London on their phone, and he just wants to be able to push a button, and now he's talking to Seth, and now he's not. Like, and you have to figure out how to get that from there, and that's where it's interesting and challenging and fun. And frankly, you know, if you're just getting into the business of audio, getting into that line of work, you will work for the rest of your life, because it's never going to stop changing, and you're never going to have a situation where, you know, everybody's using the same system and you just deploy it and it's super easy.
That's where
That's
paper.
another thing about the barrier to entry, because, you know, it's like, I think about starting out, how many terrible sounding shows I mixed, and you keep coming back for more. Like, mixed hundreds of terrible sounding shows before I got good at it, just like most people. But with the comms, you really have to come, it either works or it doesn't, you know? So if you can't make it work, you don't really get to play again. You don't want to bite off more than you can chew and set yourself up to fail by being responsible for some large scale comm system with mission critical communication, if you can't make it work, you know?
Well, I will say, and sorry, I think it was Max, somebody that was jumping in there. Early on, when I first started in the business, comm systems were mostly terrible on my shows. It was almost always everybody talking on one channel. The comm system always buzzed, and many times I deployed comm systems that were just bad. And gradually over time, I got better and better. Now, I will say the tolerance for that is continuing to decline, because things like FreeSpeak and Bolero and digital comm systems that are completely noise free, and just, you know, the end user more and more just expect that. But it's like, on the one hand, I agree with you, Jesse. On the other hand, I don't. So I don't know what I'm trying to say. But the basic principles, I think, is probably the thing that I keep coming back to, which is what I kind of talked about at the beginning, and Pete talked about at the beginning, which is just, what is it you're trying to solve? As opposed to, I have this system and I want to make a bunch of channels. Like, what are we trying to solve? Who needs to talk to whom? And not simultaneously talk to this other, like, what's the hierarchy of who needs to be able to hear? And I introduced and deployed a matrix system to a whole bunch of people who had never used a matrix system before. And it was a whole process within this company of teaching them how to have separate party lines and keep them organized and not necessarily just talk to everybody all the time. And it was a process for me to really understand who needs to hear what and when and why and how, what's the trade-off between everybody gets 24 party lines and everybody can use them. It's, that's dangerous. I want to trim that down to reasonable. And it's more soft skills and people than it is about the gear. It's who needs to talk to who. Am I making their job harder by giving them too many channels and too many options? Would it be easier for them to only have 4 channels?
When I was working for Riedel on the Beijing Olympics, we were supervised by 3 Chinese who worked for the China NASA department. They put them in charge of us, and that we kept building this giant intercom system for the director with every button in the entire system. They kept saying, "Put it on there, put it on there." The panel started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and finally the day came along, and when the director actually sat down at the position, and the poor NASA engineer came running in saying, take things off, because they were afraid if they didn't give him everything, they would be disrespecting him in China. But it turns out he only needed 1 channel.
And I would say one of the most important things on a large matrix system like that is the paperwork. And because the planning that goes in is really key. And I love the paperwork. I did an OSA gig. I wasn't the comms guy, but I looked over his shoulder, and I loved his chart, and he shared that with the audio crew. And I've made them myself and things like that. But the great thing about that document is that it lists the position, like producer, director, you just go down the line. And then you have and then across you have the different channels, and you put a little mark in there if they need to talk to that channel. And you can start with something really simple, knowing that as you get into production, that people might start asking for more. But that thing really keeps you on track, and learning, you creating that document is one of the best things you can do to keep your head around this whole thing as you get into more complicated systems. And that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say is that I knew comms were important when it went from being the last thing to get set up, when it was like a 1 or 2 channel system, to the first thing that got set up. And I know in like TV and trucks and all that, it's just it's there all the time, so you just get it out there quickly. But like in theater and other like, and other part, like performing arts and things like that, sometimes it's the last thing to get set up, and I'm like, why? That this is going back years ago, so now it's a different story.
So
yeah, I'd like 2 points. Michael had talked about documenting earlier, and I think talking about making like line drawings of this, how the system lays out. I've never really been able to get much out of that. I mean, I might sketch that kind of thing in the beginning when I'm trying to figure something out, but the documentation that really tells me how the system works is more like what Andy was describing, which is a spreadsheet, which is really telling me where everything goes, rather than a point-to-point line drawing of where stations are. So that was one point I wanted to make, was the spreadsheet type documentation I find a lot more comprehensive in the information that's in it. And the other thing is, I think one of the things Jesse's been sort of talking about is the difficulty of entry into comms. But on pretty much any show that's got one of these big comm rigs on it, it's not one person doing it. There'll be somebody in charge of it, but there's going to be perhaps multiple A2s working under them, actually doing the physical setup.
So that's something that I haven't seen on shows I work at. some shows, the shows that are big enough to facilitate a dedicated comms RF guy, I usually just see one dude.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't be a comms RF guy. It would be a comms guy and an RF guy. Two separate people.
And
Well,
I think we're talking.
I guess I haven't even been on the big enough show to facilitate that, because the ones I see is a dude who's doing well. No, I take that back. The RF will be handled by the audio crew, and then there will be a dedicated comms guy, and they'll sync up over whatever frequencies are going on, whether it's comm stuff or audio stuff. So yeah, I take that back. But
there's generally
dedicated. I don't see like C2 positions, comm assistant, where you're really getting your hands on programming the matrix panels and stuff like that, as opposed to audio, where you can really get in on the ground floor and know practically nothing and be part of a major audio production scenario.
Often, though, A2s are heavily involved with comm, at least in the beginning setup, because you're running fiber and you're putting out Beltpacks. And I've often been on the show where I'm the only comm person on the show, but I didn't put all the Beltpacks and headsets out. I just said, okay, put all these around and plug them all in, and I sit there in my desk and white glove the whole thing.
Well, and some of this is the difference between the broadcast world and the live audio world. And, we could, Pete and I could probably have a conversation for 4 hours about, and Mac too, for that matter, about, why the live audio world is a clear comm world, finger quotes, and the broadcast world is an RTS world. And then where Riedel suddenly came in and on the high end of live audio, and why those things are, and there's a lot of historical theater versus broadcast, blah 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 blah. But so broadcast shows do tend to work a little bit differently, and from live audio shows, and then that things scale from. I just came off of a show that I did locally here in Savannah, where I kept joking with some of the other hands as they were putting stuff together. Every time I'd be in somebody's way, I'd be like, I'm sorry, the audio department is in your way, because I was the entire audio department. I did everything. It was a tiny little show, and I wore all the hats. I mic'd the people, I ran the comms, I did, I put the speakers up, I did the whole gig. And then, next week I'll be a very tiny cog in a giant thing where I'm just doing a broadcast mix, and I'm sitting there punching my Riedel panel, and like there's an audio crew of 25 people. And so, if you're fortunate enough to be able to work in a lot of different environments, but I will say, like, I too totally agree with you, Jesse, that it can be tricky to get in kind of the ground floor of some of these larger comm things. I'm still kind of wanting to work as a comms assistant on a Riedel system, because I still don't really know how to put together a Riedel system. My buddy Joe works on Riedel stuff. I keep thinking, well, maybe I'll do a job with Joe where he's putting together a Riedel rig, but I always end up stuck pushing faders on some console in a closet somewhere. So it's, even I'm struggling with that. It's like, how do I, because I have this very siloed like knowledge base. I know the ClearComm matrix systems. I know the RTS analog stuff, but that's about it. And I know enough about Riedel to push the buttons and talk into it, and that's about it. I haven't had the experience on them.
I've got an example of the spreadsheet you were talking about before, and how you plan a show. This is from another show I was on. Why did it share? Okay, there we go. Come on. I know you're there.
I see it.
I'm seeing it.
Okay, it doesn't show up on my screen, but this is the same thing. It's just I got the boleros, and if I go down in the spreadsheet, there's my ins and outs into the Riedel, and here P is my panels, and the way I label it is the panels, like P211. That means it's on card 2 port, node 2, card 1. Port 1. So everything's labeled how it plugs into the system. And the way over here on the
Pete, if
right,
you don't mind. This is all coming off of one panel, one switched distribution
One
panel
node.
that accesses all of these nodes.
in this particular case, there are 6 nodes. So here you see in this list here, the Bolero is B271. It's coming from Bolero. That's node 2, card 7, port 1. And down here on the bottom, there's node 647 is node 6, card 4, number 7. So the way Riedel,
there are different locations, but there's no like master hub where one person has a panel that can talk to any one of these from one single location.
you can
It's
set
all-
that up. Yes, you can set that up.
And usually on Pete's shows, he sets himself up that way so that he has access to everything, including 4 wires, so that he can listen to IFBs and program and stuff to test it and to verify that it's working.
Okay.
And he just
that
builds-
could be either a Bolero or what was the other type of comm unit you had on there? It could be any one of these units that you set up with
a Bolero only
access
has 6.
to
A
every
Bolero
node.
has 6 channels. It's just a wireless Beltpack. But a Riedel panel can be expanded. I don't know if there is an upper limit, but you can expand it to huge numbers of buttons. So you just take 20 button panels and you just keep adding expansions
You can
on.
do a 28 button panel. You can do 6 or 8 12 button panels on top of that. I think it's 6
Okay, so you have one of
and
those
2
for
different
yourself.
pages.
Okay, so you have one Riedel panel for yourself where you can access every node from your comm desk, and then these other nodes are distributed through the theater, and they can talk to each other, but not necessarily everyone.
Yeah, it's a little confusing you using the term node, because when you're talking about Riedel, a node is a specific thing, and it's a matrix. And so you have multiple matrices that are spread around the facility. Yeah, there's
This
an illustration
is
of
my
the panel.
co-programmer on the Rio Olympics, and I only had one of these giant panels because I had very limited space where I was located. But he's down in an office and he has 2, so he didn't like using the shift page on his panels, so he put in 2. So this is a 28 button panel plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 12 button panels on top of it.
That's
And
the
it's-
Riedel.
Yeah, and that's a Riedel rig, and it's just the panels alone. That's a Tesla, probably.
Right. Yeah.
And that's the thing. It's so much of this becomes the scale, the size of the event that you're doing, the overall budget, how much money they have to throw at it.
Right. And that's not a node. That's just a user station.
Yeah,
This
I was
particular
thinking
show
of it as
had
like,
16
an
nodes.
endpoint. I guess I was thinking of a node as like a belt pack, like
An
one
endpoint.
end,
No,
No.
Walker and listener.
that just makes the terminology
Shows what I
confusing, because when you're talking about Riedel or talking about RTS Atom type systems, a node is the matrix frame, and you could have multiple matrix frames. More so with Riedel, it's a little tougher with Atom to do multiple nodes, because you have to do trunking, and it's a very complex
tri-bus.
Yeah, it's a much more complex.
But then once you interface all of these nodes, which are their own matrix switchers together,
And big fiber
you
loop.
can control them all from a GUI that plugs into the Riedel, to the master Riedel panel, we'll call it,
But
right?
you can plug it
And
into
then you
any
can
of the
have
nodes or
anything
anywhere on the
anywhere.
network.
Yeah, you can plug the control computer in anywhere on the network, and program the entire system.
And frequently you can have multiple control computers if you need multiple people working at
And
once.
the one reason I like COM so much is you don't have much work to do during the show.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah,
mixing an A1, you're trying to fix one mic and turn it on. And
yeah. Once the
run
show
20
starts, the
different things.
A1 is.
And this is what you often end up
You gotta pay
looking like
attention.
at your control position. This picture was taken by the producer.
But I will say that I've regularly had people walk up behind me while I'm doing comms and go, "Why are we paying you so much to sit here and do nothing?" And it's like, well, what happens when something goes wrong?
Yeah, that I've had the same discussion when the producer for the Tonight Show came up and said, "Why aren't you working?" I said, "Because we put in a system that works."
Well, and it's my response to all those kinds of things is, how much does your city pay the fire department, and what do they do most of the time? Yeah, I don't want
to pay the fire department if they're not busy putting out fires. Come on.
Yeah, I would prefer that there be no fires. That's the
producers
point.
Don't want to see you working too hard. When it gets close to that downbeat, they don't want to see you poking around on your console. They want to see you sitting there sipping coffee, ready to go.
Right. That's
That
the
goes for the
idea.
A1 spot too. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that depends on the producer. There's plenty of producers who think that they are paying you too much if you aren't sweating.
Right.
So we've come to about an hour. We have succeeded in talking about calm. So, and I think the fact that all we did just this entire conversation was jump off of what Pete Erskine said, which is, I don't think comms gets talked about enough. And we had no problem filling an hour, and all we did was barely scratch the surface.
I think it shows that there's a thirst for this knowledge.
So I am putting together, I didn't plan this, but I am putting together a second show where I am going to invite experts like Pete Erskine, and I haven't done any of this yet, but this is absolutely 100% true, where I am specifically going to talk about things that I don't think get talked about enough. I swear I didn't plan this. Like, I didn't even throw this in there to make a commercial, but it's 100% true. And I just put the top thing, like the very first show I want to do is, and it may be 15 shows, like it might be 15 different hours of conversations about, this specific topic. The thing
Just
I don't
look at
want to
how
talk.
many practical show texts are centered around Intercom.
Right.
It was
And-
probably a third, maybe
Easily
half.
a third. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
That's
so it's
20 hours there.
There's hundreds of thousands of hours of content on the internet about how to get the perfect kick drum sound. We don't need any more of that. But I do think, and Jesse, you pointed out, it's like, there's lots of, and not that there's anything wrong with kick drum sound. It's fine. It's just that we've got plenty of it. I don't need to make more.
We don't actually talk much about speaker cables either.
Well, and that stop rabbit trailing us. I'm trying to wrap this up.
Mine gold plated because
Get
that
talked
makes it
about
better.
too
Right?
much.
I have lost control. But yes, I think Jesse points out really well that Intercom has it's often hard to find the on ramp. And so hopefully in the future, there will be announcements that will be forthcoming about on ramps for some of these more difficult topics. I am going to wrap us. Mike Horton, I didn't hear from you. I apologize. I didn't even. Do you have strong opinions that
I
differ
figured
from
you would
everyone
chime
else?
in about networking.
Well, I was going to a different topic because I'm not in depth like you guys on comms, so I that's where I was going to go, but never got there. But that's okay.
Well, and so I apologize, Mike. Didn't mean to. I saw you there, and then everybody, just including me, wouldn't shut up. So, but anyway, thanks to my panel for contributing to talking about comms for an hour, and thereby making Pete Erskine's reason for being here make sense. I will say, Pete has been several of these shows. He has sat there and listened to us drone on and on about the difference in mic preamps, or like why this console is better than that, and he sat there and like put up with that. So I'm happy to have talked about comms for an hour. I think without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see in the description a way to join us if you want to be on the panel. The only qualifications are that you like audio and you have an opinion about something. That's it. It helps if you're like a gray-haired old guy, but that's completely unnecessary. In fact,
Or a
we have
bald
enough of
ogre.
those. It would be super great if you were not any of those things. Please
Is
come
the
on our
chat?
show.
Is the chat included with the post on YouTube?
The chat is not included, but I am going to make a point this time of pulling the links off the chat
There
and
we
putting
go.
them in the description.
Yep.
Thank you for reminding me, Pete.
Yep.
And if you're listening to this on podcast, in the description for the podcast, you'll also see a link where you can click on and join the conversation. I just want to thank all of my panelists for sharing their Thursday evening with us. And with that, I think I'm going to roll that fabulous bean footage.
Yeah, well, you know, that's like just your opinion.